All right, let's dive deep today. We're tackling human reasoning. It's how we figure things out, make judgments, and ultimately decide what to do.
Decisions.
Right. And we've got some fascinating research lined up, excerpts from a leading text in the field, and a couple of groundbreaking academic papers.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Buckle up, because you might be surprised to learn that more knowledge doesn't always mean better decisions. Emotions can play a role even in logical thinking.
That's right, even in logical thinking.
And those limits to our memory might actually be helping us spot patterns faster.
It's true. What's fascinating is that we often assume reasoning is purely objective, like a computer running calculations. But it turns out it's a lot messier and more interesting than that.
Okay, so let's unpack this. One of the biggest debates researchers are wrestling with is how we actually approach deduction. We're talking about those classic logic problems, right? Like if A then B and B then C, so A must also lead to C.
Precisely. But the way we get to that conclusion isn't always so straightforward. There are two main camps in this debate: the rule-based folks and the model-based folks.
So like, are we following a set of mental instructions or are we building little scenarios in our heads to see if things hold up?
Exactly. The rule-based theory says we have this built-in mental logic with specific rules we apply. But then you've got the model-based theory, which argues we create mental models, almost like mini simulations, to test if our conclusions make sense in different situations.
So it's less about rigid rules and more about imagining possibilities.
That's a great way to put it.
But which one is right?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question. What's really interesting is there's this experiment where people were given logic problems that looked super complex on paper, but they totally aced them, not by painstakingly applying rules, but by building a mental model that just fit the information.
So they kind of hacked the system.
In a way, yes. It's almost like our brains are really good at non-reasoning sometimes.
Hold on, non-reasoning. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, not necessarily. What it suggests is that we're drawing on our intuition and experience to reach conclusions, sometimes even more effectively than if we were rigidly following logical steps.
Interesting. So it's not always about step-by-step logic. We're bringing our whole selves to the table, our experiences, intuitions, the whole shebang.
That's right.
But how do we actually develop these reasoning strategies? Is it all just trial and error?
There's definitely a learning curve. Think
Yeah.
about those people who seem to just get it quickly. They're often the ones who are really good at spotting patterns and developing mental shortcuts based on what's worked for them before. They've refined their strategies through experience.
So they're like the mental athletes.
Yes, exactly. They've trained their minds to be more efficient.
And what about those of us who struggle a bit more? Are we doomed to bad reasoning forever?
Not at all. But unsuccessful reasoning can sometimes lead us to develop coping strategies, ways of approaching the task that might work in the short term but could actually hinder deeper learning. This has huge implications for how we think about education.
So just making things easier for students might not actually help them develop those crucial reasoning skills.
That's what the research suggests. There seems to be a sweet spot, a window of opportunity, where challenges actually push us to develop better strategies. It's like we only really improve when we need to. Think about your own experiences. Haven't you had those aha moments when you were really struggling with something?
Totally. It's like those times when you're pulling your hair out over a problem and then suddenly it clicks.
Exactly. That's your brain forging new pathways.
But even with these mental models and strategies, logic still matters.
Of course. But here's the thing. What's going on outside the logic problem itself can have a huge impact on our reasoning. Researchers call these content effects and context effects.
So what we already know about a topic, and even just how the information is presented, can mess with our logic, even when we're trying to be totally objective.
It's almost impossible to avoid. One really interesting finding is this principle called the superordinate principle. It's the idea that we often reason based on unstated assumptions about what's necessary or sufficient for something to happen. And those assumptions are heavily influenced by our existing knowledge of the world.
So even when we're trying to be purely logical, we're bringing in all this baggage, our beliefs, experiences, everything we know about how the world works.
It's like our brains are constantly filling in the gaps, making connections based on what we already believe.
There's like a never-ending story in there.
Researchers found that people were more likely to go along with an action if it seemed to satisfy this unspoken superordinate principle, even if it went beyond what a rule explicitly allowed. Like, if a friend is always there for you in a crisis, you might assume they're also the kind of person who'd help you move, even if that's not explicitly part of the good friend contract.
Oh, that makes sense. So our minds are working overtime even when we think we're being totally logical. So what else can mess with our reasoning?
Well, here's another layer, probability. We might be using probability implicitly even when dealing with logic problems that seem black and white.
Wait, so even in those straightforward scenarios, we're subconsciously thinking about shades of gray.
We are.
How does that even work?
Researchers are using tools like contingency tables and conditional probabilities to model this process. Imagine you're trying to find a parking spot downtown. A contingency table helps you organize the possibilities, weekend versus weekday, morning versus evening, to see how they relate to your chances of snagging a spot.
Okay, I can see how that's useful in real life. But what about those suppression effects you mentioned earlier?
That's when we hesitate to draw a conclusion because there might be alternative explanations for what we're seeing. Like, you see your friend looking stressed, but you hesitate to assume they're having a work crisis because you know they're also dealing with a family issue.
Oh, right, right. So we're not just taking information at face value, we're factoring in all sorts of background knowledge, even if it's not explicitly stated.
Exactly. We're constantly tapping into our understanding of the world to make sense of new information. And there's another fascinating detail that plays into this, the exceptions parameter. Even for rules, we have a sense of how often they might fail, like knowing your car usually starts when you turn in the key, but there's always that tiny chance it won't.
So it's like we had this built-in skepticism, acknowledging that the world isn't always predictable.
That's right. We're always prepared for the unexpected.
But how does this all relate to those fuzzy probability words we use all the time, like probably or unlikely?
That takes us into the fascinating world of verbal probabilities. The challenge is, translating those words into precise numbers can be like trying to measure a cloud with a ruler.
Yeah, that's tricky. So how do researchers even study something so vague?
They use this clever concept called consistency profiles. Think about how the word tall applies differently to a toddler versus a basketball player. It's all relative.
So it's all about context.
Exactly. The meaning of a word like tall changes gradually along a scale.
So a word like highly likely would have its peak on the probability scale, but it still acknowledges there's a small chance things might not go as expected.
Exactly. It's not a hard yes or no.
It's more nuanced than that.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. Research suggests that numbers and words might actually tap into different reasoning systems in our brains. It's like we have one system for dealing with hard numbers and rules, and another for processing those intuitive feelings of likelihood.
So numbers for logic and words for gut feelings.
It's a fascinating possibility. Think about your own life. Do you always make decisions based on careful calculations, or do you sometimes just go with your gut?
Honestly, it depends. Sometimes I'll weigh the pros and cons, and other times I just go with what feels right.
That's very common.
But speaking of gut feelings, those mental models we talked about earlier, they play a role in probability too, right?
They do. Mental models can actually represent probabilities by how many possibilities they include.
So the more possibilities my mental model takes into account, the less likely any single possibility becomes.
Exactly. And that leads us to something called the equiprobability principle. We tend to assume all those possibilities are equally likely unless we have information to the contrary.
Which makes sense. If I have no reason to think one possibility is more likely than another, I'll just assume they're all equally probable. But this can also lead to some pretty big mistakes, can't it?
You're thinking of something called the prosecutor's fallacy. Imagine a scenario where a rare piece of evidence is found at a crime scene, and the prosecutor argues that it overwhelmingly points to the defendant's guilt.
But wouldn't that depend on how common that piece of evidence is in the general population? Like, if it's something lots of people have, it's not that strong of a link, right?
Exactly. The prosecutor's fallacy happens when we neglect to consider what's not explicitly represented in our mental models. We get so focused on the evidence that seems to fit that we forget to ask, well, how likely is this evidence to occur even if the person is innocent?
It's like only seeing one side of the coin.
That's a great analogy. It's a good reminder that even seemingly convincing statistics can be misleading. We need to be critical thinkers and ask those tough questions.
And that's a skill we can all develop.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is a muscle that gets stronger with practice.
That's a great point. We need to keep those mental muscles in shape. But speaking of critical thinking, let's talk about another common fallacy, the base rate fallacy.
Okay, the base rate fallacy.
That rings a bell. It has something to do with ignoring overall probabilities, when we're judging individual cases, right?
You nailed it. Let's say you hear about a medical test that's 80% accurate at detecting a disease. Sounds pretty good, right?
Oh, yeah.
But if that disease is extremely rare, say it only affects 1 in 10,000 people, then even an 80% accurate test will produce a lot of false positives.
Oh, wow. I see the problem there. So even though the test itself seems reliable, the base rate, the overall prevalence of the disease, makes a huge difference in how we should interpret the results.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that just changing how a problem is worded can dramatically reduce this fallacy. It's all about making the reference class, the group we're comparing something to, crystal clear.
So in the medical test example, the reference class is the entire population, not just the people who took the test.
Precisely. And understanding this is crucial for making informed decisions, especially in areas like healthcare. Think about breast cancer screening, for example. The base rate of breast cancer in the population is a key factor in determining the likelihood that a positive mammogram actually indicates cancer.
It's like having the right context to interpret the data.
Exactly. Context is everything when it comes to making sound judgments.
So important. It's so important to have all the pieces of the puzzle to make accurate judgments. But speaking of judgments, I'm curious how all of this reasoning, probability, mental models plays into our actual decision-making.
That's a great transition. It takes us right to the heart of decision theory and how we choose between different options.
All right, lead the way. I'm ready to dive in
Welcome back to our deep dive.
into the fascinating world of human reasoning.
Where we left off, we had uncovered all these biases and mental shortcuts.
Yeah, those pesky things. So knowing all of this, how can we actually get better at making decisions?
That's the million-dollar question. And the good news is, just by understanding how our brains work, we can start to spot those pitfalls and make smarter choices.
So it's like we're being given a map of our own mental blind spots.
Exactly. Awareness is key. For example, knowing about the base rate fallacy can make us more skeptical of those attention-grabbing headlines or statistics. We need to always ask ourselves, what's the bigger picture here? What's the reference class?
It's like zooming out to see the whole landscape instead of getting fixated on one tiny detail.
Precisely. And the same goes for those framing effects we talked about. If a choice is presented as a potential gain versus a potential loss, we need to pause and consider if that framing is subtly nudging us in one direction.
So if I'm deciding between two investment options, and one is highlighted as having potential for high returns, while the other emphasizes minimizing risk, I need to make sure I'm not just swayed by the positive spin.
Exactly. Sometimes just reframing the problem, looking at it from a completely different angle, can help us see things more clearly. It's like taking off those mental blinders.
And what about those mental models we were talking about? How do we make sure we're not building them on shaky ground?
That's where metacognition comes in, thinking about our own thinking. It's a skill we can actually practice and improve.
Metacognition sounds pretty intense. Is that something everyone can do?
Absolutely. It's about taking that extra moment to reflect on our thought processes. Before jumping to a conclusion, ask yourself, what assumptions am I making here? What biases might be sneaking in?
So it's like hitting the pause button on our autopilot reactions.
Yes, exactly. Slowing down our thinking can make a big difference.
But what if I'm just not seeing my own biases?
That's where getting other perspectives can be incredibly valuable. Talk to people who think differently than you. Read articles that challenge your views. Actively seek out information that might shake up your mental model.
So it's like expanding my mental model to include more possibilities, more pieces of the puzzle.
That's a great way to put it. And by doing that, we're less likely to get stuck in those narrow ways of thinking.
This whole conversation has been a real lesson in humility. It's humbling to realize how prone we are to these mental slip-ups, even when we think we're being totally rational.
It's true. But the best thinkers are often the ones who are most willing to question their own assumptions and admit when they're wrong. That intellectual humility is key to growth.
It's a lifelong learning process, for sure. But speaking of learning, I'm curious how this research is being applied in the real world. Are educators using these insights to help students become better thinkers?
Absolutely. There's a growing movement to teach critical thinking skills, not just facts and formulas, but how to actually evaluate information, recognize biases, and make sound judgments.
So instead of just memorizing information, students are learning how to think for themselves.
Exactly. And these principles are being applied beyond the classroom as well, in workplaces, in healthcare, even in personal relationships.
So understanding human reasoning can help us communicate more effectively, make better decisions in all areas of our lives, and maybe even have fewer arguments.
That's the hope. By understanding how our minds work, we can navigate the world with more awareness and make choices that are more aligned with our goals and values.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. But there's one thing I'm still wrestling with. We've talked a lot about the downsides of our cognitive limitations. But you mentioned earlier that they can sometimes be beneficial. How is that possible?
That's a great question. It turns out that having limited cognitive resources can sometimes force us to be more efficient and even more effective in our decision making.
Wait, so sometimes less is more when it comes to brain power.
There's a fascinating body of research suggesting that constraints, whether it's limited working memory, time pressure, or even just lack of information, can push us to adopt simpler strategies that are actually more accurate in certain situations.
That's so counterintuitive. It feels like we're always told to gather as much information as possible before making a decision.
I know, right? But consider this. Imagine you're trying to decide which of two colleges to attend. You could spend weeks researching every detail, analyzing statistics, reading endless reviews.
That's totally what I would do. I'm a research junkie.
But what if a simpler strategy, one that relies on less information, actually led to a better outcome?
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more.
There's this fascinating heuristic called the recognition heuristic. Let's say you're asked which city is larger, Milan or Modena. If you're only familiar with Milan, the recognition heuristic suggests you simply choose the city you recognize, assuming it's probably bigger because you've heard of it.
So I'm basically betting on the fact that I've encountered the name Milan more often, which suggests it might be more prominent and therefore more populated.
Exactly. And what's remarkable is that this incredibly simple strategy can be surprisingly accurate, especially when comparing things from different domains. It's like our brains have learned to leverage familiarity as a proxy for other, more complex information.
So sometimes knowing less can actually be an advantage.
It's not that ignorance is bliss, but rather that limited knowledge can sometimes force us to be more resourceful and tap into those simpler, more efficient strategies.
It makes you wonder if those cognitive limitations are actually a feature, not a bug.
That's a provocative idea. Some researchers believe that our capacity constraints, those limits on our working memory and processing power, might actually be a byproduct of the evolution of these simpler, more efficient strategies.
So it's not that we're not capable of being more rational.
Hmm.
It's that our brains have evolved to prioritize these shortcuts, even if it means sacrificing some potential brain power.
That's one possibility. It really challenges the traditional view that more cognitive power is always better. Maybe true rationality is about finding the most effective strategies for navigating the world, given our limited resources.
That's such a mind-blowing perspective. It reframes the whole idea of what it means to be a rational thinker. But let's bring this down to earth for a moment. We've been talking about these fascinating theories and models, but I'm curious how they play out in the real world. What about in the messy, complex realm of politics?
That's a great question. Politics is a fascinating arena to study because it's where judgments and decisions can have huge consequences, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
So how is research on human reasoning shedding light on political behavior?
Researchers are discovering that our political views and voting patterns are influenced by much more than just logic and self-interest. Our emotions, cognitive biases, and even how information is framed can all play a powerful role.
So it's not just about weighing the pros and cons of different policies.
Not even close. For example, research has shown that people are more likely to support policies that are framed in terms of potential gains, even if those gains are hypothetical.
So a politician who promises to create jobs might be more appealing than one who focuses on preventing job losses, even if the economic impact is essentially the same.
Exactly. It taps into that loss aversion we talked about earlier, that instinct to avoid losses more strongly than we seek gains.
It makes you wonder about the role of negative campaigning, focusing on the opponent's flaws rather than highlighting your own strengths.
That's a classic example of loss aversion being used in political messaging. And it's not just individual voters who are susceptible to these biases. Political leaders and policymakers are humans too, and their judgments can be swayed by the same cognitive shortcuts.
So even the people in power are making decisions based on emotions, biases, and how information is presented to them. That's kind of unsettling.
It is, and it highlights the importance of critical thinking and awareness of these biases at all levels of government. We need leaders who are not only knowledgeable about policy, but also aware of their own cognitive limitations and the potential for bias.
We need leaders who are humble about their own thinking processes. But that begs the question, do experts make better judgments when it comes to politics?
That's a tough one. Research suggests that expertise can be helpful, especially when it comes to making predictions in specific areas.
So a political scientist specializing in a particular region might be better at forecasting political events there than someone who just casually follows the news.
That's the idea. But it's crucial to remember that expertise doesn't make someone immune to bias. Even the most knowledgeable individuals can fall prey to the same cognitive traps.
So expertise is valuable, but it's not a foolproof guarantee of perfect judgment.
Exactly. And studying political judgment is tricky because the real world is so complex. It's hard to isolate specific factors that lead to a particular outcome. There are just too many variables in play.
It's like trying to untangle a giant knot.
Another challenge is that political judgments are often deeply intertwined with personal values and ideology.
So our beliefs about how the world should be can end up coloring how we see things.
Absolutely. It can be tough to separate objective analysis from those pre-existing beliefs. It's like we're all wearing these ideological lenses that filter our perception of reality.
And those lenses can be hard to take off. But the goal of this research is to help us become more aware of those biases, right? So we can make more informed and objective assessments.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have these inherent biases and working to mitigate their influence on our thinking.
So it's not about eliminating bias altogether. That's probably impossible. But it's about striving for greater awareness and objectivity.
That's a great way to put it. And that awareness is a crucial part of being a responsible and engaged citizen.
This deep dive has really taken us on a journey. We've explored the intricacies of human reasoning, from those mental models and probability judgments to the psychology of choice. And we've seen how all of this plays out in the real world, from education to healthcare to the political arena.
It's been a fascinating exploration of what makes us tick, how we think, how we decide, and how we make sense of this crazy world around us.
The biggest takeaway for me is that we're not just passive victims of our cognitive biases. We can actually learn to understand them, challenge them, and make choices that are more aligned with our values and goals.
I love that. We have the power to become more conscious and intentional about how we think.
It's like we're being given the tools to become better versions of ourselves, more rational, more insightful, and more effective in navigating life's complexities.
That's a beautiful way to frame it. It's about personal growth and empowerment through self-awareness.
This has been an incredible conversation. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to something very personal, the role of intuition.
Okay, let's talk about gut feelings.
We've been focusing on how our thinking can go wrong. But what about those times when we just know something in our gut? Is intuition just another form of bias, or is there something more to it?
That's a question that has sparked endless debates. But more and more, researchers are recognizing that intuition isn't just some mystical force operating outside of reason.
So it's not just woo-woo thinking. There's some actual science behind those gut feelings.
Absolutely. Intuition is actually grounded in our experiences and the vast storehouse of knowledge we've accumulated over time.
So those gut feelings might be based on subtle patterns and cues that we've picked up on without even realizing it.
Exactly. Think about a seasoned doctor who can often make a diagnosis just by observing a patient, even before running any tests. Or an experienced chess player who instantly sees the winning move without consciously analyzing every possibility.
It's like their brains have developed these incredible pattern recognition systems that allow them to bypass all those logical steps.
That's a great way to visualize it. Intuition is essentially a highly efficient way of processing information, drawing on years of experience and accumulated knowledge.
So it's not necessarily irrational. It's just a different way of thinking.
And research suggests that intuition can be particularly valuable in areas where we have a lot of expertise.
So if I'm in a field where I've spent years honing my skills, those gut feelings might actually be a pretty reliable guide.
There's a good chance they are, but it's crucial to remember that intuition isn't infallible. Even the best experts make mistakes, and sometimes our gut feelings can lead us astray.
So how do we know when to trust those intuitions and when to be more cautious?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer. But paying attention to the context can be helpful. If you're in a familiar situation where you have a lot of experience, your intuition might be more trustworthy. But if it's a novel situation or one that's highly emotional, it might be wiser to slow down and engage in more deliberate analytical thinking.
So finding that balance between intuition and reason is key.
Exactly. We need to be open to those intuitive insights, but also willing to step back and analyze the situation, especially when the stakes are high.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've explored the fascinating landscape of human reasoning, From those cognitive building blocks to the biases that can trip us up, and even the power of intuition.
It's been a real adventure, and I think the biggest takeaway is that we're not just along for the ride when it comes to our own thinking. We have the power to understand how our minds work, to develop our reasoning skills, and to make choices that are more aligned with who we want to be.
It's an empowering message.
Absolutely. We're not just products of our cognitive biases. We can learn to recognize them, challenge them, and ultimately become more conscious and intentional thinkers.
This deep dive has given us a whole new set of tools for navigating the world with more clarity and purpose.
That's what it's all about. And I hope this exploration has sparked a sense of curiosity and wonder about the incredible power of the human mind.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
It's great to be back. As we've been exploring all these facets of human reasoning,
It's amazing, isn't it?
it's amazing. I'm struck by just how adaptable our minds really are.
It is. It's truly remarkable. Our brains are constantly evolving, finding new ways to make sense of the world.
Absolutely.
It's like we're constantly downloading new software updates,
Yeah,
learning new tricks, expanding our mental capacity.
I like that analogy.
Think about the challenges we grapple with today, that our ancestors never even dreamed of the sheer volume of information we process, the lightning-fast pace of technology, the interconnectedness of global events.
It can be overwhelming.
It's mind-boggling, and yet we somehow manage to keep up.
We do. Our minds have evolved these incredible coping mechanisms and strategies for making sense of it all.
So even though our basic brain wiring might be rooted in our evolutionary past, our minds are still adapting and evolving to meet the demands of modern life.
That's precisely what makes the human brain so fascinating. It's not a static organ. It's incredibly plastic, constantly rewiring itself based on our experiences and the mental demands we place on it.
That's so empowering. It means we're not stuck with whatever cognitive limitations we might have inherited. We can actually train our brains to become sharper, more focused, more adept at reasoning.
That's one of the most exciting areas of research today. Scientists are exploring all sorts of techniques to enhance cognitive function. Everything from mindfulness meditation to brain training apps to cutting-edge neurofeedback technology.
So it's like we can hit the mental gym and give our reasoning muscles a good workout.
That's a great analogy. Just like physical exercise strengthens our bodies, cognitive training can enhance our mental agility, flexibility, and resilience.
This makes me want to ditch my usual crossword puzzle and download a brain-boosting app. But before I do, there's one last puzzle I'm hoping you can help me solve.
Okay, I'm all ears.
We've talked a lot about the potential pitfalls of reasoning, those biases, heuristics, and cognitive shortcuts that can lead us astray. But I'm also fascinated by the role of intuition, that gut feeling that sometimes guides our decisions.
Intuition is a fascinating and often misunderstood aspect of human cognition.
So is it just another form of bias in disguise? Or is there something more to those gut feelings?
There's a growing recognition that intuition isn't just some mystical force operating outside the realm of reason. It's actually rooted in our experience, our accumulated knowledge, and the intricate web of associations our brains have formed over time.
So those gut feelings might actually be based on subtle patterns and cues that we've picked up on subconsciously.
Precisely. Imagine a seasoned chef who can tell just by tasting a sauce whether it needs more salt or a touch of acid. They might not be able to articulate exactly why they know, but their intuition is drawing on years of experience and a deep understanding of flavor profiles.
Or think about an experienced firefighter who can size up a burning building and instantly know the safest way to approach it. Their intuition is based on countless hours of training and a deep-seated knowledge of fire behavior.
Those are great examples of intuition in action. It's like our brains have developed these lightning-fast pattern recognition systems that allow us to make judgments and decisions quickly and efficiently without having to consciously analyze every detail.
So intuition isn't inherently irrational. It's just a different way of processing information, one that relies on subconscious pattern recognition and accumulated experience.
That's an important distinction. And research suggests that intuition can be incredibly valuable, especially in fields where we have a lot of expertise.
So if I'm a seasoned pilot, my gut feeling about a potential engine problem might be worth paying attention to.
It's certainly a data point worth considering. Your intuition is drawing on years of experience with aircraft engines and a deep understanding of how they operate. But it's crucial to remember that even expert intuition isn't foolproof.
So we should listen to those gut feelings, but not blindly follow them.
Exactly. We need to be aware of the context. If it's a familiar situation where we have a lot of experience, our intuition might be more reliable. But if it's a novel situation, one that's highly emotional, or one with potentially high stakes, it's crucial to engage our rational minds as well.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, a balance between trusting our gut and engaging in more deliberate analytical thinking.
That's a great way to summarize it. And it speaks to the complex and multifaceted nature of human reasoning. It's not just about logic or intuition, but about integrating both, along with our experience and knowledge of the world.
This deep dive has been such an incredible journey. We've explored the inner workings of our minds, from those fundamental cognitive processes to the biases that can trip us up, to the often overlooked power of intuition.
And we've seen how all of these factors shape our judgments, our decisions, and ultimately our understanding of the world around us.
The biggest takeaway for me is that we're not simply at the mercy of our cognitive quirks. We can learn to understand them, to challenge them, and to make choices that are more aligned with our values and goals.
That's the beauty of studying human reasoning. It empowers us to become more conscious and intentional in our thinking.
It's like we've been given a set of tools to navigate the world with more clarity, purpose, and wisdom.
What a fantastic way to sum up our exploration. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you all. Until next time, keep those minds engaged and those questions flowing.